So today I am going to do a video talking about the story of the Crypt. So if you don't know, I made a video a while ago that's called The Loss of Yu-Gi-Oh's Artistic Essence, where I mentioned the story very briefly, just commented on it, and a lot of people were asking me about it and to get into a little more detail and really explain. And it was something that I was putting off for a long time talking about just because I wanted to bring my best friend to talk about this with me and be a part of the video. Unfortunately, we've tried now for like a month to coordinate this, and it just doesn't happen because the time zones are so different. We're both really busy, and it's just been hard to make it happen, so I'm just going to tell it. And I just wanted to say sorry here for the delays on the videos. I've been really busy this week with work, and honestly I've been playing a lot of poker. I've just been super busy, but I'll try to be, I usually want to always upload at least once a week, but usually I aim for twice a week, so hopefully we can get back on that trend here after this. So the story of the Crypt. So if you guys, a lot of you guys probably are new to the channel, or maybe you've never seen this video before, so I'm just going to retell it like you've never known anything about anything that I said before. If you want to go watch that video, I will link it on the description. It's the original video that I made kind of mentioning this briefly, but I will re-explain this as if you have never seen that video. So I am an American citizen that grew up in Brazil. So I grew up in Brazil from about 3 years old till about 15 years old. And in that time, I went to a private Catholic school. And during this time growing up was the big Yu-Gi-Oh boom here on the West, where we had the first generation of Duel Monsters, and I did get a little bit of the GX era and then of the 5Ds era as well. I still currently play the game, but the story is more around that time, just to give you a little bit of context. So around this time, I don't know how it was everywhere else, but this seems to be, from the responses that I got, something that a lot of people went through, where Yu-Gi-Oh! It was kind of in that middle of the satanic panic. You know, Yu-Gi-Oh! Was considered a devil's game. A lot of people were getting their cards confiscated by their parents, being prohibited from playing. A lot of people went through this, and most of my friends really, I didn't have that happen, but most of my friends, that was the case. Well, what we did have happen was that, again, we went to a Catholic school, so the entire school banned Yu-Gi-Oh! After a while. Once the priests caught on that, you know, we were playing a game that had rituals, summoning, tributing demons and whatnot, they were like, yeah, this is a devil's game, so anybody that gets caught playing this game is going to get suspended and eventually expelled, right? And me and my friends were not going to let that stop us, right? We were obsessed with Yu-Gi-Oh! So we had to find ways around to play this, and essentially in hiding. And we had to really do this in a way where it wasn't just hiding anywhere, because if we got caught again, that's a suspension, and then if it happens again, you're expelled, and we weren't about to stop playing, right? And it was funny because a lot of people, and this was even during a time where Yu-Gi-Oh! Stopped being cool as well, we kept doing this, which is interesting because a lot of the cool kids, quote unquote, would still play Yu-Gi-Oh! They just wouldn't tell anyone. It was kind of funny to see them in tournaments and like, hey man, please don't tell anyone I'm here. People were just like so embarrassed after a while that they still play, and I'm like, I don't care, man. I'm not gonna tell anyone. You can, you know, I'm not trying to ruin your popularity contest. I just don't want to be a part of it. But anyway, so the school I went to in South America was, again, it's a private Catholic school. It was a school that was originally built by Hungarian monks back in God knows how long ago. And originally this was not a school. It was just a church that these monks, they built, and eventually a school was built around this church. Now this eventually became one of the most sought out and prestigious schools in Brazil, right? It's a very good school. But at that time when it was still starting, it was just to give you an idea of like how Catholic this school was. It's like literally the classes were taught by priests in robes. They have all these historical pictures, and there's a lot of history in the school that they display, right? So you see a lot of pictures of the PE teachers being the actual priests playing in robes. Like you can see them like teaching basketball and track, and they're freaking wearing robes, you know. Looks very impractical, but that's the kind of school I went to. And you would think that it would be more like there was nothing. It definitely toned down a bit over the years by the time that I was there, but for this in particular, they were still very adamant that, you know, you take things like lewd material, you take like games that are considered satanic and things like that. There are certain things that are definitely off limits and will get you expelled. Drugs, for example, alcohol, right? There are things that will get you expelled on site, and low-key, a lot of people were doing it, right? You just can't get caught. Personally, on the drug side, that's never something that I partook in at that age, but I do know there's people that did. Some people snuck in alcohol. That's a separate story that I'm not going to talk about right now. But anyway, What was interesting about this is, again, we were put in a position where we couldn't play anywhere, and on top of that, we enjoyed playing gambling a lot of the time, so we would gamble for each other's cards. So that added a layer of, problem, because if to be in our circle to play, you had to really be our friend and you had to really understand the rules. Because if you lost a card and the other person took it from you and it was this big deal and you made a big deal about it, eventually, like, the principal would find out about it, they would find out that we were playing, and it could ruin the whole thing. So we were very, very selective about the people that we even let play with us, right? Furthermore, there wasn't that room because I mentioned this on that video. So I used to play a lot in a crypt, which was the crypt of the church. So this church had a crypt, like every church has, or at least every Catholic church. I don't know if every church has that, but essentially Catholic monks and priests, they get buried inside of the church in what's called a crypt. So there are different rooms, or one big room in a church where all these priests get buried, right? And we knew how to gain access to the crypt, and we played a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh there. And this was something I mentioned, and people wanted me to elaborate a little bit on it. Again, I wish my best friend could be a part of the video, but it's too hard to coordinate, so I'm just gonna talk about it. So basically, the way that this church was built, this entire school was built on a mountain, and the Catholic Church was very famous back in, way back in the day, for building these massive tunnels and things like that underground, because at the time the Catholics were persecuted, right? So they needed a practice in secrecy, right? So they built these massive catacombs and things like that. I don't know how much of that my school really had. I don't think it did. Maybe this is what that was, but it was modernized, because my school didn't really have catacombs. I wouldn't call it that. What it had were, and I wouldn't even call them tunnels, it had very long hallways that cut through this mountain. So we learned that if you go into the church, when you're walking in, you go up the stairway that can go either left or right. And when you go up the stairway, you get to the main hall where it's the actual church, right? Where they hold the sermons and things like that. However, there's a pillar right in the middle before you go up the church, where if you go around it, there's an actual door. And I'm not entirely sure why that door was always unlocked and opened. It was like a glass door. And I think it's because just some people needed access to it, and they just kept it unlocked. And I don't think they thought that students would be going there, because honestly, we weren't really allowed to be accessing the church off hours where, there's a sermon going on. Like, you couldn't just go up to the church and go in there, right? So me and my friends were in a very privileged position in a way, because my mom passed away when I was about 13 years old. When my mom passed away, this was a whole event on the school. A lot of people came to my mom's funeral. I'm talking like, gosh, my entire grade. So that's like, there's about 4 classes per grade in that school with about 30 something students. So probably like 130 people came to that, just like students. It was like a whole school event. So the entire school knew about it, which for me was really awkward. Like, yeah, that's the kid with the mom that died, But it wasn't like, nobody ever made me feel like that. It wasn't like that at all. It's just because I was really friends with a lot of people there, and they kind of made this petition thing to be able to go to the funeral, and they went. So that was cool. That was my friends, family, and school were very supportive about that. But one of the things that came with that was a privilege where the priests were like, hey, if you ever want to go to the church to pray, or if you ever want to come see us, feel free. I had this pass where if I wanted to get off in the middle of school and go see the priests and hang out with them, almost like counseling, I could do that, and I did do that several times. Or if I wanted to just go to the church and pray, I could do that, and there was no real restriction for me on that. And, it's funny because I spent a lot of time with the priests at my school. They were very, very good people. It's almost like I don't want to talk too much about this, because I feel like it's a little bit of a weird subject and not really the focus, but it's interesting how many allegations and actual situations of abuse and things like that are involved with children and priests and things like that. I heard a lot about that in the US, and I'm sure that it happens a lot in Brazil and in South America as well. But maybe I was very lucky. Like, nothing like that ever happened to me when I was a kid. The priests were the most amazing people in my life. They almost acted like counselors for me at a time, that I was very, very sad, and I was very alone, right? Because my dad lived in the United States. I had just lost my mom. I hadn't had contact with my dad in years. I was basically an orphan. Like, not to dwell on this subject too much, but my friends will tell you before I started living with my grandparents, my mom was a lot in the hospital before she passed away. And even after that, there were extended periods of time, whereas a like 12, 13, 14-year old, where I was basically living alone. Like, I had two dogs, and food was basically brought to me, and I basically lived in our apartment alone while my mom was in the hospital for months at a time, or a little bit after she passed away as well. So I pretty much grew up like an orphan for a while, and my friends will be the first to tell you, like, if you went to my house, it was literally like, imagine like a 12 or 13, 14-year old living on their own. What would the house look like, right? It would be a mess. There would be pizza boxes everywhere. There'd be leftover food everywhere. It'd be a mess, right? That's exactly what my house was for a while, because I was basically like fending for myself and surviving on my own for a long time, which, that caused my grades to suffer. I was never the best student or anything, regardless. But yeah, I mean, if you're alone at home and there's nobody really telling you, like, take the trash out, clean the dishes, eat healthy, make food, do your homework, you just don't do it, right? So I was just basically eating pizza and playing video games all day, and occasionally my friends would come over, and we would drink and play poker and things like that. So it was an interesting time of my life, which extended to the United States as well. There were long chunks of my life where I basically grew up alone, which, looking back, is very weird to let like a 13, 14-year-old grow up on their own. After, when I came to the United States, I was older, right? So I was 15, 16. At that age, it still doesn't make sense, but it made a little more sense while I was kind of on my own. Not entirely. At the point where I moved to the United States, I had family. And it was interesting because during this time, I was very young before in Brazil. And yeah, man, my house was a freaking mess. I mean, it was fun. Don't get me wrong. I had no rules. I could do whatever I wanted. I could eat whatever I want. And my friends could come over whenever they wanted. And basically, like, my friends' parents would just drop them off occasionally to see how I'm doing and, like, give me some support. And they would just come there and we would just play poker. It was like paradise, honestly, for kids, because it's like, oh, here's this house with no adults, no parents, and just this guy living on his own. We can do whatever we want, type of thing. So it's an interesting time period of my life. And other than my friends and their parents and whatnot, these priests were there for me, right? And nothing weird ever happened, man. Like, a lot of people think, oh, like, this kid is going with the priest alone and all this. Oh, I'm sure there's something weird going on or whatever. Nothing like that ever happened, thank God. I was too naive as a kid really to know that that was even a thing. That's not ever something I was exposed to, thankfully. But I never saw or heard of anything like that. The priests in the school were the most amazing, caring, and genuine people I have ever met. Some of them I still maintain contact with till this day. I was very blessed to have those people in my life. And they were there for me at a time that was very hard. Nevertheless, so I was able to gain access to the church anytime that I wanted. So the way it worked basically is there is this gate where is one of the gates where it's an entrance to the school by car, and there's a guard that basically stays there. And on occasion, like the first time I asked him, hey, just so you know, is it okay if I go to the church? I've been given permission. Because, everything that happened with my mom. For you to have an idea, even the school employees, like guards, knew about what I was going through, what had happened to my mom. And they're like, oh, yeah, no, you're fine. You can go. I'll confirm that it's fine for you to go. Give me a minute. I'm going to radio someone and you should be fine. Yeah. So since that day, basically, whenever I or my friends, and they assumed that my friends were just going with me, it's not like it was a ton of people, we're just kind of going there to support me. Most of the times we could just go in without checking in with them, or they didn't even see us going in. The church was always unlocked. It was accessible at all times. And it wasn't like a big no-no to go to the church. It's just not normal, right? Most kids don't go to the church, so they usually ask, like, what are you doing here, type of thing. But I'm sure that if some random kid asked to go there for whatever reason, they would allow it too. But we pretty much went almost every day at one point to do this. And honestly, for the most part, we didn't need to check in. We just went in. So that's honestly how we got access to the church. Eventually, we found out this door that I was talking about. And this door leads to, you go down through the church. And like I said, so these are not really catacombs. These are almost, and I don't want to call them tunnels because it's more modern than that. They're more like these massive hallways that go multiple directions and they cut through the mountain that the school was built in. So it's not like it was necessarily like underground, but it was in the inside of the mountain the way this was built. And it's interesting because there's certain points that the hallways they go out of the mountain and circle around. So you can see like open air for a little bit and then they come back through. It was really interesting. So we ended up, one of these hallways led to this room where, we were just, kids poking around. We were looking at every room. There are rooms for different things. Honestly, a lot of these rooms seemed like almost like prayer rooms and like reflection rooms. I don't know really what they were used for. But one of them in particular was a crypt. And there were people that were buried there like for centuries, like, for a very, very long time. And that was a place that had a little small light, right? And that was a place where we knew nobody was going to look for us. There were no cameras. Nobody's going to find us there. So we played a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh! In that crypt. And that became one of the main places where we played a lot of time because we got caught everywhere else that we would go, right? So that was the one place where nobody would catch us. So that's where we were playing Yu-Gi-Oh! A lot. We were playing among the dead priests. And that was also the Dungeons and Dragons spot. That was the gambling spot. And we used it for a lot of other things as well. And honestly, nobody ever caught us there. And we just played. Nothing ever like sinister or weird really ever happened. On occasion, we would hear footsteps and we would turn off the light and just like be quiet because we thought somebody was coming for us. But it never really happened and nobody really ever caught us, and we just played in that crypt a lot. So we played amongst the dead people, which added to the whole vibe of Yu-Gi-Oh! Of the time, which I talked about. Now on a side note, what was interesting about this too is one of these main hallways, it would lead to this place, a very, very big place with a counter and a bunch of employees working and stacking things on shelves. And what that was a massive pharmacy, which is very, very weird. I never quite figured out what that was used for. I have my ideas. Just to give you an idea of size and scope of how big these were, I think that if I had it's about the size of a grocery store. So it wasn't like a little pharmacy. It was way bigger than you would see like a CVS. Massive, like like a big counter, almost like there was a clerk that should be working there. And these hallways of massive, massive shelves stocked with medicine. Basically what it was a pharmacy of the school. So I have my ideas without accusing anybody of anything because I don't really know. In theory, when I asked about this, I went to the infirmary at one point and I asked them about it and told, yeah, that's probably where they store all the medications that we used. I'm like, yeah, but it's not just, it's too much. Like it's almost looks like industrial. It almost looks like it's not like they're producing the medication there, but it looks too industrial. Like it's way bigger than like a Kaiser pharmacy, way bigger than like a CVS. It's just a massive. Why do they need so many drugs there? And they're like, I don't know, right? It's one of those things where you don't know, don't tell. And I was too young for them to have an honest conversation with me about it, probably. I think that there is probably the less dark version of that, where it was probably just because my school did a lot of charity and supported a lot of local communities. So probably that was a lot of charity work where they would donate medications and things like that to these different less privileged schools or daycare centers and things like that. That's what I'm assuming it probably was, or in part was, right? But I don't know if that was entirely the case. So this school, for you to have an idea, the reason why I'm very suspicious of this, and there's a lot of parts of those halls that I didn't get to explore, right? Because if I got caught there, I could get, expelled, or Jig would be up. They would know that we were there playing, and I don't want to poke around too much, right? But this was a school that extremely, extremely affluent people went to. And I'm not saying this of all of South America. I'm not saying everyone is like this in Brazil. The vast majority of people that went to that school were just fine, and their parents earned money the legitimate way. Like, for the most part, everybody was fine, right? But there were a large chunk of these people that were associated with politicians, that were associated with the mob. The girl that I grew up having a crush on, her dad and her family ended up on the newspaper because one of their restaurants, their chain of restaurants, was being used to funnel money from illegal gambling in casinos and things like that, which, if you don't know, gambling in Brazil, casinos are illegal. So, and there are massive illegal operations in casinos throughout the country, right, for that reason. And apparently her parents got caught for laundering money for them or owning them and using it as a vehicle for laundering money. I had friends that were their grandparents were very famous politicians and owned massive and massive properties, right? With land and nothing built on it, with no explanation as to why that land was there. I have a lot of stories about that, but involves people who are private, right? I don't want to get into that so much, but my point is there's a lot of shady things that happen in that country. If you're from Brazil, you know there's a lot of shady things in general that happened, and especially when you're dealing with some of the richest kids and families in the country going to the school, you're bound to find a percentage of them that acquired that wealth or are involved in things that aren't entirely legal. And to be honest, most things in Brazil, it's not that most things aren't entirely legal, but everything has a little bit of a could be dubious. There's a part of this that might not be entirely legal type of thing. It's very common over there as it is in other countries. Not everything, but a percentage of things. So I wonder sometimes, my suspicion is, what were those drugs that were there? It's not like they were sacks of the green stuff or something like that and sacks of powder, nothing like that. They looked like genuinely bottled medications and things like that. So I would assume it was less dubious than it really was, probably. But knowing what goes on in Brazil, I can only imagine what was going on there. But so that is where we spent a lot of the time playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Honestly, at that time, we were very amazed by this, but if I had to think of the most logical explanation, I don't think anything nefarious was going on. I think, honestly, they were just, for whatever reason, however, they acquired that massive amount of medication. Maybe they were buying it and stocking it to then redistribute it to less fortunate communities. That's what I think was going on, because my school had multiple social projects that we would often visit these daycares of people that were, less privileged and bring them toys and donations and things like that. So my school was very involved in the community around it, very philanthropist. They supported a lot of the local communities around us. And, much like everything, nothing's really out of just charity. There was a big component of that because we were right next. Our school was built around it. It was built a favela. If you don't know what a favela is, it's like our version of slums in Brazil, basically. And they're massive in São Paulo, where I'm from, right? And what my school would do is they would do all these projects and they would pay the leaders of the favela basically to leave the students of our school alone, right? Please don't kidnap these kids. Please don't mess with them. Here's a bunch of money. So there was a lot of that going on. Not all of that was charity. A lot of it was almost like protection money. So specifically when it comes to the crypt, that's the story. There's more that I could go in about my school, but or what goes on in Brazil. But that's not so much the focus of the video. I wanted to specifically talk about just to explain a little bit of more depth how we got access to this crypt and why we were there and all that. It's not super fantastical. There's not really more to it that I can think of. And I'm not about to start making stuff up, right? So that's kind of how that happened. We played in that crypt for about a couple years, maybe 3 years. And that was kind of the spot for the longest time. And then eventually we became a little bit older, and outside of the school we could go to tournaments and things like that. So I competed a lot in locals for Yu-Gi-Oh! And that is the story of the crypt. We spent a big chunk of our childhood playing amongst dead priests because we weren't allowed to play everywhere. The things that kids will do to be able to still partake in their hobbies when parents start, freaking out over things that maybe they shouldn't freak out about. Like the whole satanic panic, we really felt it going to a Catholic school, right? The fact that we had to go where people got buried in a church to play just to not be expelled because of the game we liked just goes to show you the level of hysteria that Yu-Gi-Oh! Caused when it was originally created, right? I don't know how it was in other countries. I've heard that it was very similar in most of the West. A lot of people have a similar story. But for sure, for me, it was very real. A lot of my friends had to hide their cards from their parents. I kept a lot of my friends' cards so that they wouldn't get ripped apart, right? My best friend, has a very traumatic story that he could be here to tell you about his grandma ripping all his cards, and man talks like that, like it's trauma from like Vietnam or something, like he's a Vietnam veteran or something talking about it. But yeah, a lot of kids lost their cards, had them ripped. And torn and thrown away because, again, it was considered the devil's game, right? It goes to show how the original theme of Yu-Gi-Oh! Was very dark and, very occult-like, and why honestly it made it so cool and badass and mature. And I've talked about this. I think that this game probably wouldn't have been banned now if that was the case, because it just doesn't look mature, adult, or satanic in any way, or doesn't have the same occult inspired themes anymore. I've talked about this on my other video where I think it's very like anime like now. But it goes to show you at that time what the perception of Yu-Gi-Oh was. It was considered very cool and edgy and mature. I've talked about this. I wish Yu-Gi-Oh would go back to that, because that was one of the main reasons I really liked the game. I really liked the art and the theme of it, and I've talked about on that video that I mentioned how it lost a lot of its essence. But anyway, that is the story of the Crypt. There's not a whole lot more to it. There's more that I could talk about the school. There's more I can talk about individual people and things like that. But as far as the Crypt, which is the focus of this video, and it already got so long, that's the story. A lot of those catacombs and hallways we didn't really explore. Honestly, we didn't want to get caught, so we didn't go poking around a whole lot. And I'm not about to start making things up, right? So this is kind of what happened. People wanted to know a little bit more about it. There it is. That's the story of the Crypt.